we heard from the analytics side. Now we're going to hear from the BI side. Here we have Eyal. He's a senior BI analyst at, senior BI engineer, I apologize, at Alexa Shopping at Amazon here in Tel Aviv. Alexa Shopping integrates voice recognition with Amazon e-commerce, allowing users to make purchases with the sound of their voice. With this venture, Amazon is hoping to dominate the emerging field of voice-activated shopping. Eyal has a broad perspective in both data and business. He worked previously at SimilarWeb, which is very data-oriented, as a data scientist and as the CEO and co-founder of DNA7, which is a SaaS that uses the power of organizational network analysis for workforce optimization.
Thank you. Can you all hear me without the mic, or should I? Mic. Can you hear me? Mic. So, hello everyone. Shira introduced me very nicely. I actually had a couple of slides just for that, just to introduce myself. But as Shira mentioned, my background is mostly from the business side. So if you can see around it, I majored in economics and accounting. I mean, I know nobody's perfect, but I think since then I took a turn. So actually, after my graduation, I went and started a startup, which you can see in the organizational network analysis field. I was working mostly as the CEO, so I did mostly business development. I was not working on the algorithmic side. After that venture, which was eventually successful, came back to Israel and started working for SimilarWeb. For those of you that are not familiar with SimilarWeb, it's a company that basically provides metrics about engagement in websites and apps. So the entire company is very data-driven. The product is data, both the numbers and the data side, both in the visual side. And of course, every part of the organization is extremely data-oriented. As part of that effort, I started as the product analyst for the entire product team. Later on, I also took the customer success, part of the understanding that in B2B, bottom of the funnel, where your customers are, it's important to understand both the customer side and the development side. It actually has a lot of benefits. After that effort, I actually started the professional services unit in SimilarWeb. So think about the company having its web product, where you can go ahead and query any website in any country in the world. But some strategic customers, some enterprise customers, have a much deeper need for very specific data. So instead of looking for a specific website, maybe they're looking for a specific journey. So think about how people are actually buying online, how they're making the choice of whether to buy on Amazon or Walmart, how many review sites they would browse before actually making a purchase. So there are a lot of interesting points here. Worked with customers such as Amazon, Google, Microsoft, eBay. It was actually quite varied and interesting. And about 3 weeks ago, I started my new role at Amazon. As Shira mentioned, I'm a BI engineer there. Basically, BI engineering is kind of connecting the BI development and the BI analysis together. So think about if you're in a small organization and you care about frugality, you don't have many resources, you may want a technical person to also own the business side. And I think this is kind of a tricky feature. It's not easy, right? I don't know how many of you are from the technical side and how many of you are from the business side, but I think that each and every one of you knows how difficult it is to be on the other side and how difficult it is to communicate with people from the other side. So we're actually trying to combine the two together, and there are certain challenges around that, and I want to touch how we're trying to bridge those challenges and how we're trying to connect the development side and the business side together, whether it's one person who does that or a couple of teams or an entire organization who work specifically on that. I'm not going to talk about Alexa Shopping at all today. I may give a couple of examples. This is not PR for Amazon or Alexa Shopping. And I suppose Shira already introduced what we do, but I just want to say that there's a peculiarity about being a BI person that is part of the actual development engineering team. Basically, in Israel, we work on the search engine for Alexa shopping. So on the BI side, we kind of have two challenges. One is actually measuring the success of the engineering side. Are we actually managing to bring in good results to our customers? But also measuring the downstream effects. Are we helping the company convert those people into buying users, which is kind of like more on the normal side of BI, what we would normally measure either in B2C or B2B organizations. Before I start, any questions for me? Feel free to stop me at any time if you have any questions. All right, so I want to talk about three things today. One is about the backlog. I think it's an important thing to talk about. I'm not going to discuss everything there is to know about the backlog. I just want to give my input around backlog and BI. There are some specific complexities that other engineering teams don't have. The other thing is engaging with your customers to improve your outputs. What kind of questions, how to interact with your business customers so that you can actually deliver to their expectation and making sure that you're perfectly aligned with them. The last part, it's actually the most difficult part, is how to exceed their expectations. Actually give them the kind of data and the kind of tools that they didn't know they could ask for. I will give some examples about that, but we'll get to that in the end because it builds on the other 2 points. All right, so I will not repeat one definition that I found on the internet. There are many definitions, but basically a backlog is where you put all the tasks that you need to do in the future. You prioritize them by order of importance, by order of value, by order of management wants something. It's just as good as a priority as anything else. And once you finish a task, you just pull out the first task from the backlog and you work on it. It's relevant whether you work in development, whether you do business analysis. You always have to know what's next for you once you finish the next task. And I think the main problem with backlog, even if you are in a very agile organization, is that the more successful you are, the quicker it grows, right? So if you're doing something very well, people will come to you and they will ask more questions. If you've created a very interesting analysis or created a very good dashboard, people will want more of it. So it's kind of a two-edged sword, right? It's a good two-edged sword. But you're creating something good, you're working very hard, and you're creating more work for yourself. So kind of know that when you're working on something, if your backlog is actually getting larger, then it's actually a good sign that you're doing something good. But there are a couple of things that are problematic, and specifically for BI, there are dozens of tasks that just land on you at any given time, at any given day, mostly for management, and it's always urgent, right? It's never, oh, we could be ready within a week or two. It's always for later today or for tomorrow. And it always pushes your backlog away. And I think from my experience, and it's never easy to have this kind of conversation, but it's always important to discuss the cost associated with such tasks. So even if there's something very urgent that has to happen right now, that's fine. You don't always have to argue about it. But make sure you calculate the cost of it, how much time it took, and what is the alternative cost from not doing the other task. Once you have that, you can actually, once a month, once a quarter, you can sit with your managers and you can tell them, look, there is a lot of noise coming into the team, and it's very important for us to make sure that we're removing that noise because we're losing a lot, because the cost is very significant on that. So I think I mentioned a little bit about that just now. I've written some kind of a formula. It's not a mathematical formula per se, but it's an important kind of line of thought to have with yourself as you're working on analyzing the cost of pushing some efforts down the backlog. So think about the additional cost that it takes you from doing that task, minus the savings that it creates. Most of these requests will not have any savings related. They're usually just, I need this data now. So this is kind of like theoretical, but there are certain tasks. For example, if you're preparing a WBR, weekly business report or review for the management, and they ask you to add more KPIs to the report, it actually has some future benefits for both the management team and yourself. So sometimes it would have future values, sometimes, and very often, it would not. And the next point is to add the delta of the cost from the backlog task that you've pushed away. So if you wanted to do an infra improvement, it's not working, and it's very important to reduce costs and improve the velocity of your ability to create the analytics, then it's very important that you actually make the point that it's to remove that cost from so I'm sorry. Any question about that? All right, so just a small example. So the request is to add 5 new metrics to a weekly business review. Let's assume that it takes a couple days of work, and it would provide management with better visibility. On the other hand, your backlog plan was to create a dashboard for sales managers. So there is definitely a trade-off cost in actually not creating the dashboard or delaying that, because the sales managers are actually using that on a daily basis to make sure that their pipeline is optimized. So you may not have the ability to completely push back on the request, but your managers have to understand the cost associated with such a request. And of course, whether it's with management or with your peers, it's always important to ask the hard questions. And I'll touch some examples and more information about that in the next chapter. Any questions about the backlog part? All right. I think it's kind of a conundrum, right? We have the stakeholders. They're important for us because we have a job thanks to them. However, they are always a pain in the ass. They always have demands. They need things. They don't understand the limitations, whether it's your time or data limitations. So it's kind of important to, one, know your customers pretty well. If your BI team has a product manager, then it's great because they can own the conversation, they can own the knowledge, and they can share it with you. But even if they do, and even if they don't, it's important that you yourself understand the business that you're actually measuring. So it's not enough just to be able to query the data. It's really important for you to understand what are the KPIs, or what makes your customers successful. Once you do that, it's a little easier to communicate them on how to actually build better KPIs and better tools for them. And maybe the most important thing is transparency between the two groups, right? You want them to be transparent with you. You want them to tell you exactly what they need and how they would want it. You also want to be transparent with them. You want to tell them exactly how much effort it would take to create certain things, and how you would want to create certain dashboards or certain data points. And I don't like the title of the slide because I feel like it's a little new age. But it's very important to have a can-do attitude. From my not so short experience, what happens very often with BI developers is that I've actually noticed that they tend to say no very often to requests. And I think part of this conversation shouldn't be about saying no, but rather it should be about trade-offs. If I need something, of course I have to trade it off with the needs of other people in the organization. But more so than that, I have to understand and I have to explain very well why I actually need that data, that tool, and that information from the BI team. So if I try to kind of say so not so many words, don't decide for your customers what's important for them. Don't tell them no. Just be very transparent and tell them the cost and tell them how much time it would take to actually produce that. Your customers are adults, right? Most of them, not all, not everyone, but most of them will be adults. And you can give them the information and you can allow them to help you prioritize your development or your analysis task. And part of that process is about asking questions, right? And I think that was one of the most important points that I advertised for this talk today, is that you have to ask a lot of questions. It makes you a better BI professional. Again, whether you're on the development side or certainly if you're in the analysis side, to know and understand the business of your partners perfectly. And the more you know, the more you can have a professional conversation about their domain, not yours. They don't care about the select from. They actually care about what are kind of the insights that we can get from the data. And if you understand the kind of insights that they're looking for, they will consider you more of a partner than an executioner. And I think this is the highest level of BI that you can get to. When your peers are considering you equal to them, when they have confidence in you, they will come to you and they will ask questions, they will take your advice, and eventually down the road, you can actually tell them what you think you should do and not just be reactive and receive requests from them. And I've written a few questions here. It's not limited to these questions, but I feel like they're very important. So when we're talking with our customers and trying to understand what they're trying to achieve, it's very important to ask them, let's assume that you had the data. What are the actions that you would take from it? Right? A lot of time people ask for a lot of data. They ask for, I want this, and I want this, and I want this, thousands of different things. But they don't even know what they're going to do with it. They don't have a plan for that. They don't know. They said we'll explore. Exploring usually does not lead to anything meaningful. You have to have a zero hypothesis. You have to kind of have something that you've researched, especially if you're working with product managers, for example. They have to tell you, I think that our customers are doing this and that. I want to check whether it's true or not. And then it's up to you to decide how to query the data. So let them tell you what are the actions that they will take from the data, and then you can tell them what kind of data is useful for them to get for their questions. A couple of other things, and I think points 2 and 3 are connected together. In a perfect world, what kind of data would you like to have? And how would you like to have it, right? So it's not just about what kind of actions you would like to take. Sometimes they don't know yet, and it's fine. But let's assume that you could have anything that you want. What is the data that you would have? Think about this question. It's actually a very powerful question because it gets them to think about the perfect situation, the perfect scenario, and they actually tell you where you want to get to from this point on. So you're at point 0, and they already tell you where the finish line is. And once you know which path you want to take, and of course the path will diverge, and there will be many paths, and you will change your objective as you go. But it's always good to know, at least to have some future into what you're trying to get into. And of course, where is the best place to consume the data? It's not necessarily an Excel spreadsheet, and it's definitely not necessarily Tableau or any other tool. So it's really important to understand where they would like to consume the data and for which task they would like to do that. And this slide just talks exactly about that. You have to meet them halfway with their requirements. Of course, it's easy for us to always deliver an Excel spreadsheet or maybe do a simple dashboard in Tableau because it's just an output of our query. But it's not always where the customers would like to meet with data. So I think the best example would be salespeople. Salespeople live in the CRM. They don't want to go outside to Tableau to consume the data. They need to have the data inside Salesforce or any other CRM. So it's very important to understand who your customer is and where they would like and how they would like to consume the data, because that will have a very strong effect on the adoption of the tools that you're creating and the adoption of the data that you've queried. Otherwise, it will be a one-time thing. They've asked for it, they looked at it once, and from my experience, they don't come back. A couple of customers may be very diligent, they'll come back. Most of them will not. If it's where they always work in the environment that they're used to, where it's easy for them to access the data, then they will always consume the data because it's in their face. So think about those kind of trade-offs, and it's usually useful to invest a little more time to actually make sure that the data is available in the right tools in the right time.
I have some comment about this.
Of course.
As to my experience, it's sometimes worth educating the customers. Because if I ask all the time, how do you like to use the data, to consume it, they will always say Excel is the best way, if they don't know how to use Tableau. But if I educate them how to use Tableau properly, they will do it much faster and in a more convenient way than Excel.
Okay, I'm just repeating the question for the video. You were mentioning that it's about education. People always want to consume the data in Excel because they're maybe too lazy or they don't know how to work with Tableau, and it's our role to actually educate them. And I think it's a good point. I don't disagree with that. I think education is part of our job. We have to do it all the time, but we have to. This is why I said meet them halfway and not all the way, right? You can tell them, look, and it's actually something that I'm going through right now. My managers are used to consume the data in Excel. It's been going on in Amazon for as long as they remember before they joined the organization. This is how it works. And Amazon actually have access to amazing dashboards, amazing tools that you can actually build really scalable, easy, beautiful solutions that are very hard to do in Excel. So in Excel you have a lot of numbers, but sometimes the visuals are telling the story, right? And so this is something that I'm actually pushing into. So you can actually tell them, look, if it's an ongoing process, if it's an ongoing product that they will use daily, weekly, monthly, then you can, one, quickly deliver what they're asking for. So take this Excel. But I'm actually going to build a tool that will enable you to consume it somewhere else. And this is the last time that you will receive this Excel spreadsheet. Next time will be on the tool, and we'll work together to ensure that you know how to use it. So this is really my point of view, and I agree with you on that point. You have to push down. You have to push back on some of those requests, and just make
Not
sure.
only ask, that's what I meant. Not only ask the consumers, but also to tell them sometimes
Absolutely.
what is the best way.
Absolutely. So the next slide is about the different tasks that we have. So as BI, we usually have, from my experience, 3 different types of tasks. One is ad hoc requests. I need a report on this. I need you to run a query on that. I want to know something. It's very important to do that, but it's very important also to leave that to very complex business questions. If you repeatedly get asked very simple questions, then ask yourself, why don't I have tools that actually answer those simple questions? Simple questions should be available for consumption for your partners on an ongoing basis. Sometimes there will be a simple question that is not relevant on an ongoing basis, and it doesn't take you very long to provide. That's fine. But if it's a repeating task, then it's very important to make sure that you productize it. If it's a very complex task, then my recommendation is do not productize it. Because very complex tasks usually have a tendency to be very different and very complex at every step of the way, right? So one customer will need a very complex analysis on the sales funnel or on the customer journey, and it will be great for that specific sales manager or for the marketing manager. But for the other one, it will not be as useful. So you cannot create a dashboard on that. There is nothing to productize here because just for one person, maybe it's not for consumption, maybe it's just for market research purposes. But you can actually use that knowledge into understanding how you can actually propagate that knowledge around the organization. And around tools, so as I mentioned, if it's a simple and recurring task that you get asked repeatedly, then naturally build tools for that. Build dashboards, create, if your customers are SQL savvy, then create SQL templates that they just need to insert variables and run the query. It's actually very, very simple and intuitive way to do that. So for example, we have a thing we call paper cuts. It's a small customer experience issues that are annoying to the customer, but they're very ad hoc, right? You would not see them from the big data. It's just annoying things that people are encountering on their experience. And if you've worked in B2C, you know it's those small things, it's those annoying things, and you as a customer probably know that make you not want to come back to the product. So if you can build a tool, so this kind of question is deterministic, right? Because there is only a certain number of tests and examinations that you can do in the data. Why did we give back that kind of result? Why did that kind of behavior happen? So you can actually create a data set that includes potential answers for that, and they just need to input some variables, tell you when it happened, in which marketplace, in which region, depending on the type of business, and then they can run the query itself. It's very hard to build dashboards for those kind of things because dashboard would have to show specific KPIs, and here we are showing a larger data set, but if you allow them to actually input some variables, it makes it a useful tool. So there are two things about that, repetitive and deterministic. Those are the two tasks that you should build tools for. The last point is something that business users hate. Developers don't love, but we have to do it all the time, is the tech debt. We want to make sure that we're always efficient, that our cluster is clean, that our processes run fast, saves money, that we don't store data that we don't have to, that we bring in all the data sources we can potentially have. So I know you want to have the data from the CRM, you want to have it from your billing system, you want to have it from your marketing automation system. And there are a lot of different platforms that you want to have the data. They constantly add new data points. And your company constantly purchases new products, so you constantly need to get a stream of new data into your data warehouse. So it's important that you always devote time. I think usually it's around 20 to 25% of your plan to backlog. And it's very important that you explain to your business customers why you do that. So from my experience before I actually started working on the development side, and I worked on mostly on the analysis side, it used to get me very frustrated that the development team would spend so much time on tech debt, on the infrastructure tasks, where instead of actually creating the KPIs and the tables that we need to do our work. And I think that now that I'm in both sides, and in many ways I've turned to the other side, I think I've got to the understanding that it's very important. And the development ability to actually deliver the BA or other business consumers in the organization with the perfect product is very dependent on a very good infrastructure. Otherwise, what really happens in the end, and I'm not talking about new data sources, if the data infrastructure is not proper, eventually processes get stuck. Your daily extracts, your daily refresh of data get errors in the process, and you actually don't get anything done. So you don't get constant things working, and you cannot provide any new analysis. And I think I want to go back to a little more on the self-service. It used to be a very important conversation in SimilarWeb where I worked. Everyone was constantly talking about self-service. And from my experience, it does not work, and rarely ever works. Your business customers, they have a certain idea into what they need. They don't understand the challenges of the data. They don't have an understanding and like a larger point of view on the limitations of joining different data sets together. They don't have an understanding of how data actually works. And even if they're data engineers or business managers, unless they have a very intimate knowledge with your data warehouse and your tables, it will be very hard for them to be self-sufficient. So I think as I mentioned before, it's very important for you to build tools for those simple tasks and recurring tasks that happen all the time. But it's also very important for you to make sure that you push back on those requests to create self-service tools that your customers eventually cannot use. This will just really save your time. And I think to finish up this chapter, go on to the final one, it's very important for you to own the conversation. Whether you are in the development side or in the analysis side, you want to make sure that you are the subject matter expert on the data. That when you get asked questions, one, you know whether this data exists or not. You don't have to, like, people don't like to be told, I need to check. You want to have that kind of point of view fast. So whether it exists, it doesn't say anything about whether I can produce the analysis, but rather whether I have the data to create this. Once you do that, you also have the knowledge of how the different tables and the different data sets are working together. You know the joins, you know how they interact together, and you know the limitations of the data. So you can already tell them, we have the data, we might be able to do this analysis, but there are limitations, 1, 2, 3. Once you do that in the initial conversation, you're a hero to the business manager that you're talking with, because they know they can trust you, they know you know the data very well, and they will trust your eventual output. And it's very important that they trust your eventual output. Questions before we move on? Either you're very bored or I'm being very clear. And I think it's the first one.
Yeah. I just want to say, one thing that I found at our company at Investing is that a lot of times the business stakeholders, they're a little bit intimidated of the data. When you talk about meeting them halfway, I think it's important, something that I've personally tried to do is be like the first point of contact for questions, and I also do trainings for business managers who think they know what's going on and they think they know how to handle data, but at the end of the day are very overwhelmed by it. And it just like makes it, when you explain it in business terms and tell them, you're not crazy, you're not stupid, you're like, this tool is hard to use, it's made by engineers, it's not meant for people to use. Like, they feel like validated that they're not crazy, and then they're willing to ask you the questions that enable them to really get the answers they need. Like, people were pulling like wrong data for like months because they were too scared to say, I don't know this, I don't really know this. And so therefore, I think it's important on the analytics team or BI team to have that person who's like the first point of contact to basically make people feel like not scared of it in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I will repeat it just for the video. Sure mentioned that meet them halfway point. It's important to make sure that you have a person of contact that the customers can come to and ask questions, that they feel comfortable when they're actually going ahead and creating their analysis. She mentioned a certain scenario where people were querying the data for many months and querying it wrongly. They're probably using the wrong filters, summing up the wrong fields to get the metrics. It happens very often. It also happens to us as BI people, right? We do that sometimes, but we have a better way to QA ourselves. So we need to make sure that we're actually providing an environment that is very open for them to come and ask questions. And I think that brings me to some of the last slides. So the topic of this organization was how to actually go the extra mile and actually ask and create the tools that they were not, that your customers did not know that they actually need. So in order to do that, there are actually a couple of things that need to happen. One, you need to understand that there is no easy solution to that, right? I mean, I think regardless of BI, companies are trying very hard to invent products that customers didn't even know that they need. And when you're talking about product they didn't even know that they need, we don't even know where they would like to consume it, how they would like to consume it, how often they would like to consume it. There are a lot of open questions here. And you want to do all of that without spending too much effort, putting too much effort into your analysis, right? It cannot take you a month to create that kind of tool or that kind of analysis. It has to happen fast because people want to see results. They're not convinced that there is actual value in what you're trying to provide. So the prerequisites for that kind of analysis is, first of all, you have to understand the data and have very good technical skills. That is something that you must have before you can you even think about going into that kind of venture. You have to have very clear understanding of how the data is built around structures, the infrastructures, and how you can use it in ways that it hasn't been used before. Now, maybe it hasn't been used before in your organization that way, but other organizations have probably tried to solve a similar problem, right? We're rarely ever inventing the wheel. Even if you're working for very large companies like Amazon, there are small startups that are probably working on cutting edge problems, and they're probably working on that specific problem that we don't know how to solve. And if we're a small company, there's certainly other companies, whether they're working in our field or larger companies that are actually available and ready to share some information with us on how to solve this problem. And one other thing that is very helpful is trying to forecast the problems. So sometimes as BI, you know that there's going to happen some change management process. You know that there is an incoming change in the sales organization, a restructuring, which means that new sales managers are going to get new teams. They might get different regions. Maybe account sizes are going to change between inside sales and enterprise. Once you already know that beforehand, you can actually create the analysis that will be useful for the sales managers before they actually know that the change is going to happen. And even if they know the change is going to happen, they don't know what to ask right now because they're still trying to adjust to the new situation. And you can make their life easier. So this is just one example. Sometimes, most times, it would be more complex than that. It would not depend on a certain event, but rather it would depend on your intuition that there's something missing in the process. And that intuition has to come from your master understanding of the data and master understanding of your customers' business problems. You have to know their business problem just as well as they do, if not better. And I know it sounds weird, like how would I, as a BI, be better at marketing than the marketing manager? Well, you will not be a better marketer than the marketing manager, but you can definitely be more knowledgeable around their problems and what they're trying to solve. So this is kind of a recommendation that I have, is to always know more about the problems that they have and they do. Make sure you always read and you always come with solutions, but also act with frugality. Make sure that when you're doing something, try to have quick products. Try to test if your hypothesis is correct. You're thinking that your customers need a certain product. It would take you several months to build a product end to end, but maybe within a couple of weeks you can actually show something and see if they're actually interested in that kind of solution. A/B testing in development is something that any development team would do, and you have to make sure that you're not exempt from that practice. So how does it all come together? So I talked about a lot of different topics. And it all starts with your backlog. So you have to understand your priorities. You have to understand the cost and the value of the products and the analysis that you're creating. Once you know that, and once you know your customers, you know how to communicate with them, you know how to lead them and ask them the right questions and allow them to ask you follow-up questions, then you can actually offer solutions that they may not have thought about. I quickly mentioned Salesforce, giving salespeople their BI data in Salesforce. So what normally salespeople would ask you is, can you populate Salesforce field with this data? It will be very useful. And they're correct. It's very useful. But what you can actually do is you can put a Tableau dashboard that is embedded within Salesforce. And it's much more powerful than any of the other fields that you can populate. It's visual, and it's right there in their eyes. So this is just one example of something that they would not know that they can ask. But if you know their business and you know their challenge, then you would know that this is a better solution than populating constantly on and on more fields in Salesforce. And I think the last point that I want to make is be right a lot. So this is one of Amazon's core principles, and it's the first thing that my manager told me when I came. BI people don't have the luxury of being wrong. People trust you to bring them the right data. They usually want it fast. You cannot be wrong very often. You have to be right all the time. It's not just about that your analysis is right. It's also about how long it would take you to make that analysis. Can I even make this analysis to begin with? Because sometimes you want to please your customers. Tell them, yes, I will create the analysis. Eventually come to the realization that you just don't have the data for that. So just make sure that when you're going into a partnership with customers, that you are right. And that's it. Thank you, everyone. And I'm open to questions.
Which BI tools do you use at Amazon?
So to repeat the question, she asked which BI tools do we use at Amazon. So for SQL, we use Redshift. Kind of
original.
makes sense. We also, for our big data pipelines, we use Spark, which is, in my opinion, it's a much easier and nicer tool to use. Sometimes we use Athena on top of data that is not in our Redshift cluster. We also use Spectrum to save space on the Redshift cluster. So if you're not familiar, Spectrum is external table on Redshift. So you don't have to copy it to your Redshift cluster. You can actually read it directly from S3. For visualization, we use QuickSight, which is an Amazon tool. I don't like it very much. We also use Looker, which is it's a pretty nice tool. There is some learning curve to get it to use it because they use a weird version of SQL, which is kind of like mishmash between SQL and XML. And this is mostly it. We have a lot of production and internal tools that I cannot talk about, but they're mostly around the production engineering part and how we actually move the data from one place to another to make sure that people can consume it.
Could you please tell us about your daily job? What tasks are you working on? Who are your customers?
Okay, so the question was about my day-to-day job. What do I do when I wake up in the morning? Who are my customers? So as I mentioned before, I'm kind of in a weird position. I work inside an engineering team. So I'm actually a BI person inside an R&D team, and I'm not part of the product team or a business team. So my agenda is basically being the intelligence person for the engineers. So I need to help them make good decisions on where to invest and what to code. There are so many things that you can do, and there's so many unknowns in that business. And voice search is really just in the very early stages of it being a thing. And everyone believes that it's the next frontier, but we don't know that yet. And we need to have a very strong data understanding of how we want to move, where we want to move to, and which path we want to take. So this is really my goal. The way that I do that is there are two main things to it. One is working with the management to actually create the reporting, the weekly reporting or the monthly reporting that the management team would go over and read every time. This is the kind of task that you want to productize. You want to make sure that it's available at a certain time. But this kind of task also bears with itself a lot of prerequisites. So the other thing is actually building the pipeline, the data pipeline. So we have a lot of big data that comes from different streams, and we're building different Spark processes to make sure that the data is available for consumption on Redshift. So there is a lot of ETLs that we're creating. Some of them
You
are
do it.
Sorry?
You do it.
Yes.
You personally do it.
Yes. Some of them are SQL based. Some of them are in Scala and Spark. So this is most of it. A small portion.
Just a question when you're finished.
A small portion of my time is dedicated to ad hoc analysis. But right now, because we're a very small team, I'm actually trying to focus on the larger problems and make sure that we're actually building tools for people to be self-sufficient. So I mentioned before that I think one of the best tools that you can create, and Redshift is not the perfect tool for that actually, is to create templates for queries that people can just input certain variables and just run it. So sometimes you mentioned that they want Excels. I don't want to produce those Excels for them. But if I give them the template, then they can run whatever they want. I just need to make sure that I'm creating the right filters and the right joins for them so they don't make mistakes in connecting the data.
It's like self-service.
It's somewhat self-service. So I think my benefit is that I'm working with big data developers in general, the entire team. So they understand data, they know how to use SQL. Right? So I'm not really afraid that they will abuse those queries. So it really depends on who your customers are. But in my example, it works very well. It's just a limitation of Redshift that it does not allow you to actually put variables. So you actually have to do like temporary tables with your variables, which is kind of a silly thing.
And what are the examples of Ad-Hoc?
So examples for Ad-Hoc analysis would be why are we given certain results that are being rejected by our ranking systems, and can we offer alternative results that were eventually accepted by the user? So we want to understand how we currently rank our products. Can we change the ranking? So this is not necessarily something that they would like to consume on an ongoing basis. This is just a decision that they want to make now into understanding if they would want to go into a process of changing the ranking algorithm. Just an example. Yes?
A question that I keep getting as a meetup organizer, what is the ratio between data engineers and data scientists and BI people in your department?
So the ratio between BI developers, business analysts, and data scientists, I think from my experience, usually you would want to have about roughly a ratio of 1-to-1 between developers and analysts. This is, I think, a healthy ratio. The number of data scientists that you would need really depends on the team, but usually you want to have less. The issue with data scientists is that they require a lot of preparation before they can actually work, and they require a lot of post-production and maintenance. So the more models you're maintaining in your system, the more people you actually need, the more data engineers you actually need to maintain them. So you always want to have more data engineers than you have data scientists. For analysts, it really depends on their technical skills. Some analysts are pretty technical savvy. They know SQL, they know the system, so they can be pretty self-sufficient. And some analysts usually know how to work with Excel, and they would need for you to provide more data. And in that scenario, you would want to have more developers. But I don't think there's like any magic numbers. I think it really depends on the specific organization.
Basically, what you said is industry gold standard, but
yes, I suppose I did not invent the wheel here. There are some standards, and it works. It's a standard because people understand that it actually works that way. Again, I think when I started working at SimilarWeb, actually, I never coded. I coded in my high school, and I was traumatized by that. So, so I never touched the line of code after that, and I didn't know SQL really. So I actually did all the technical transformation from that point on. So really, if you can also hire non-technical people if they have the right acumen and the right tendency to learn that. And if you have that, then you can actually train them over time to take over part of the development work. All right, thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Ayala. That was fascinating. Really, thank you. I also want to thank Google's Canvas for Startups for hosting this. And I want to thank my co-organizer Omid for being my mentor in planning this and all the technical issues. And he's a data engineer, so definitely the tech side. Yeah, I mean, I would love to, first of all, this is all video, it will be online, hopefully the presentations will be online, I'll let you know about that. I look forward in the future to creating more events on this topic in terms of marrying the tech and the business of data to create more value, and thank you for coming.